Recently, I wanted to explore vehicle audio further, in particular, a granular playback tool from Crankcase Audio called Rev. For those unaware, there's basically three main methods for core vehicle sound playback in games. Loop playback, generally multiple fixed RPM recordings crossfading between one another. Granular playback, which uses an acceleration ramp recording and then plays back small random moments relative to the RPM. And synthesis, where no recordings are used and instead digital oscillators and noise generators are processed by additional DSP to try and recreate the sound of an engine from scratch. There are many resources that go into the pros and cons of these implementation methods, so I'm not going to discuss those here. But what struck me as odd, though, is that the majority of vehicle audio within AAA titles tends to lean on granular playback for their core vehicle sounds, but this also seems to be the playback method with the fewest resources and materials demonstrating how to use it. So I thought a video demonstrating this attempt could be useful to others and a nice way to wrap up my exploration here for now. In this video, I'm just going to break down my prototype with a look at the implementation and the different layers. If you want to get Rev set up for yourself, I'll post a link with some steps to follow on how to get rolling. Although racing games are the most obvious genre featuring vehicles, they're definitely not the only place we find vehicles in video games. But even if we just look at the racing game genre, there's still a wide range of different styles. So my intention was to aim for something more natural and closer to a simulation style. This way, the audio systems are easier to evaluate and not entirely subjective, but not so authentic that I'm trying to match a particular make, model, or engine type. So to start things off, here's a quick preview of how my results turned out, and then we can actually look at what went into it. Here's a breakdown of the layers I felt were necessary to create a vehicle demo in this style. Exhaust, engine, tires, suspension, turbo, gear shifts, wind noise, pass bys, ambience, and then a look at the general overall mix. Exhaust and engine sounds are really the core of the vehicle's audio and likely what many people think of when they imagine the sound of a car. Because both engine and exhaust sounds have a direct relationship between pitch and RPM, this is where we'll get into using Rev and why I'm going to spend a little bit more time on these first layers. I'm using two instances of Rev, one for the engine and one for the exhaust. This will allow me to mix them independently and place them appropriately on the vehicle model. In order to use Rev, you add an instance of Rev as your sound source to an object in Wise, and then you load a model. A model can hold multiple files for acceleration, deceleration, and an idle. Technically, the only sound needed is an acceleration file, but the quality will definitely be improved if you add the others. The Rev manual states at a minimum to get a 10-second accel or decel recording to create the partial, and I also found that really smooth, consistent accelerations tend to produce better results with less artifacting. It's very clear why a lot of folks prefer dynos for this. There are a good number of presets that come with Rev, and these may be great for demonstration or portfolio purposes, but I went with a dyno sample pack from Pole Position, so I had some more representative content to try for myself. If you're creating the partial in the Rev standalone tool, start by marking the top and tail of the acceleration ramp. You can either select Auto Tag, choose the best harmonic for Rev to build the ramp around and see how it sounds, or you can go manual and mark this for yourself. For those that have no idea what we're looking at here, this is a spectrogram of the audio recording. Time is left to right, and frequencies are top to bottom. So zooming in on this range will definitely help us get a better view, and then we can see the harmonic content much better. The main goal when you analyze your performance is that it identifies the fundamental frequency correctly, and you should get a complete ramp across the provided RPM range. I found that manual tagging on a spot that identifies each of the harmonics works best. If you have other sounds in the recording like wind, rocks, or backfires, you may want to edit those out before this step as they become quite noticeable in the final model. Once you analyze your content, you can preview it in this window. Don't be too hard on yourself if the results don't sound amazing here. You're controlling the sound of this engine with your cursor, not a pedal. So you can do things here that aren't very natural with a real engine. For a better preview, send the partial to the simulator and you'll have more realistic throttle control along with the default transmission setup, and it's likely going to start sounding better right away. You can also link this with a controller and experience how it might feel across common controller inputs. I did this for both the exhaust and engine sounds, and then loaded those into Wise on 2 different sound effect objects. When it comes to implementation, Rev makes it pretty obvious which key parameters need to be modulated in order to control it. So we need to set up an event to trigger the sound and then some RTPCs to control those parameters. For this demo, I'm just using the vehicle template project in Unreal. This project is pretty basic, and there's no default method to start or shut off the engine, so I'm just hooking up a play event for Rev right on begin play. The rest of the values we'll need to set up with RTPCs are throttle, RPM, gear, and velocity. Throttle is quite easy. This is just a value of how open our throttle is between 0 and 1. This is controlled by the set throttle event, which is elsewhere in this blueprint, which updates when the throttle value is changed. Gear and velocity are also very easy. We can get these right from the Chaos Vehicle component and then update our additional RTPCs here on TIG. So the last RTPC to set up is RPM. We can also get this from the Chaos Vehicle component. If you played around with the standalone simulator in Rev, you may have noticed some options for engine and transmission details like gearing ratios. And now, if you look at the details in the Chaos Vehicle component, you may also see fields for similar settings. Remember that none of the Rev tool simulator settings are embedded in the model, so tuning the transmission in Unreal is ultimately what's going to affect your sound. What I did do here is define in the Chaos Vehicle settings at what RPM I wanted my automatic transmission to change gears at. This was a pretty normal RPM that made the vehicle behave appropriately in-game. But the Rev RPM range is actually much higher, so I mapped the vehicle's RPM to an increased range, which I used to set the Rev RPM RTPC. This means that the vehicle still behaves as expected in-game, but we get the full range of audio. So for tires, there's 3 main layers that were supported: rolling, debris, and skids. For the primary rolling sound, I'm just using a blend container to play back slow and fast variations with some additional DSP and pitch control based on velocity. The other sound here is a debris layer, so we hear little pebbles and rocks bounce off the body of the car to give us some additional transients to help cut through and sell an additional connection of the vehicle to the surface. This is playing from our retriggering random container with a variable duration, and these sounds both start from our on-play event and have additional RTPCs controlling based on surface and speed. The last element of the tires is for braking, so when we slam on the brakes when we're going fast, we should hear the tires skid and squeal. The implementation here is super easy as the braking action is already set up in the vehicle pawn blueprint. I made a short one shot when the braking starts, and this is triggered by the braking start event. I also made a constant braking loop off of that same event with a bit of a fade in so it naturally starts underneath that one shot. Then we have a stop event for that loop. It's hooked up to the braking stop. These are also controlled by RTPCs to ensure that these braking sounds will get quieter as we slow down and may not even be heard below certain speeds. So suspension is kind of a fun one. Here we're looking at the displacement of the wheel in a vertical direction. Essentially, is the shock compressing or expanding? We can then look at the acceleration of this value to determine whether or not there should be any suspension noise. For example, when braking suddenly, I would expect there to be 2 moments of suspension noise. One for when the brakes are first pushed and the load of the car shifts forward, compressing the front shocks. Then again, when the car either comes to a complete stop or if the brakes are released, the weight shifts back to a natural center of gravity and the front springs become uncompressed. So if we check the difference of this value between frames, it can let us know if the shock is actively expanding or compressing. We can then set our audio system to either play one shots from these moments or use this to modulate a suspension loop, and that's what I'm doing here. Turbochargers are small turbines some vehicles have, which is spun by the exhaust from the engine. This small turbine spins incredibly fast and will be used to force more air into the intake of the engine, resulting in an increase in horsepower. This can produce a pretty noticeable rushing or whining sound as it gets up to speed, and an iconic flutter sound when decelerating or downshifting, as excess air is unused by the engine and flows backwards through the turbine. For the prototype, I broke this into two components, a whine sound and a flutter sound. I'm using the whine to support the gear shifts and help the overall mix with a little bit more high frequency content, also while using this to create more anticipation and suspense leading up to those gear change moments. We know that the automatic transmission in the game is going to shift for us, and it does so at a preset RPM. So by increasing the volume of this loop tied to an RTPC with RPM, we can increase the volume as we approach those shifting RPMs. For the flutter sound, I'm just taking the gear change and off throttle events to trigger one-shots. There's a lot more that goes into when the sound can be heard in real life, but leveraging it for this purpose gets the point across and it adds more interest to the demo. Gear shifts are incredibly important because they help us break up the persistent vehicle sounds with nice transients. Even if our engine, exhaust, and tire sounds are all great, they can become quickly fatiguing if they just remain static. Gear changes are a chance to break this up and reliably create some more interest rather than just hoping the player does something interesting. This gear information is also available from the Chaos Vehicle component, and it does shift to neutral before each destination gear change. So if we're in second and go into third, we would get a neutral in between. So when we hook up a one shot to each gear change, this actually gives us a nice satisfying ka-chunk. So for this, I created two layers of gear shifts, one for slow speeds and one for high. At slow speeds, we'll hear a more natural gear shift kind of sound. It's more diegetic as if we were in the car. And then at higher speeds, it's a more mechanical designed one, which will help cut through the engine noise and create a little bit more interest to support these more dramatic moments. Wind sounds are really important to help sell a sense of speed. Again, because wind is primarily noise, a blend container with assets for appropriate speeds can help support the wind sound rushing over the body of the car. This starts on begin play and is modulated by velocity. It doesn't take long playing games like Forza or Need for Speed to notice how dramatic the Pass Bys are, and for good reason. This sells danger, excitement, and it gives us a nice transient to help break up the constant drone of our engine. So for this, I split it into two layers, overhead Pass Bys and side Pass Bys. We go under a decent amount of bridges and billboards in this demo, and I wanted these to have some supporting audio. However, these pose very little risk to the player, so I made these a lower frequency and have softer envelopes, and ideally they should sit in a place in the mix where they're sort of felt more than heard. To trigger these, I created a volume above and in front of the player's car and at a height that it would clear road obstacles but catch these overhead structures. So when the object enters the volume, we trigger a one shot, and this is modulated by speed. So if we dramatically decelerate after one has been triggered, or if we were just going too slow in the first place, these won't be heard. So for side Pass Bys, I wanted some audio awareness of the wall if you got too close to it on corners or if you were drifting off track. When driving close to the walls though, I started to notice the fence posts more visually as they were kind of whipping by, and I felt it more appropriate to support those instead of just a kind of drone of the walls. Unfortunately, the model for the track walls combines the fence posts and the chain link fence, so doing simple object detection won't work right away. This could be fixed in some other ways, but a simpler approach for this I felt was just modulating this sound with a tremolo effect that roughly matched the speed enough to serve its purpose while driving. So we don't really care that it's perfectly accurate, but we get more interesting modulation that matches this sort of passing shape at the edges of our vision, and really just kind of supports the emotion better here. Last but not least, for the main audio components, Ambience. This is really to be the foundational audio element for everything else to sit on top of naturally, but the first to get out of the way once the player's vehicle audio starts. So this is sidechained pretty aggressively by vehicle sounds. However, if we stop, we can hear some other track activity and just get a sense of the overall atmosphere and space. I've also marked out a few of the grandstands with crowd sounds. These are pretty basic. Please don't get me started on crowd systems. Because we're already talking about sidechaining, it's worth mentioning some other components of the broader mix as well. To help all of our audio components sit into the world and mix together a bit better, I've added a short slapback delay to most of the sounds in game. This makes sense as we have low parallel walls around the whole track, and it just helps to make things feel a bit more natural and less like a collection of discrete sounds. There's only one overpass in the whole level, but going underneath this feels like it needed a little bit of support to add some additional interest around the track, so I added a reverb volume with a wider reverb to make this feel a bit more dramatic, even if only for a second. If you've stuck around this long, thanks so much for checking out the breakdown of this demo. I'll do a full lap here shortly so you can hear the full mix without me talking over it. Overall, it's clear why granular playback is a common choice for a lot of high-quality games. But as we saw, the final result is likely going to be a combination of many layers and playback systems rather than just focusing on one playback method alone. A massive thank you to the number of other game audio folks I spoke with when putting this together. I'm always incredibly thankful for this wonderful community. And if you're interested in getting this set up for yourself, I'll share some additional resources on how to get this up and running. Thanks so much for watching.